Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this is the fourth episode in our Foundations in Genesis series, and we're going to be discussing the nature of evil. This is going to be a two-part episode because there's just so much that I want to talk about. Part one tonight is going to be devoted to bringing to life a story that you've known since you were a little child, the story of Cain and Abel. The problem with reading it in your Bible is that if you just look at the words on the page, you get only a very incomplete picture of what's happening. And I realize as I prepared for tonight's lesson, there's so much missing material that it's going to take me the entire evening just to bring that story to life. So I hope that you gain as much from this knowledge as I did in preparing it. We're going to spend most of our time just on this one slide. Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. And I'm going to read this a verse at a time and then stop and fill in what's missing. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. So let's go back and see how much is in here. The first word, now. Well, what's happened right before this? When is now in the story? What is immediately preceding it is verse 24 of Genesis chapter 3, which describes the flaming sword and the cherubim, which guard the way to the tree of life. So this is the end of their time in Eden. It's the beginning of their stay in the world that they helped create, the world whose nature they chose in Genesis chapter 3 when they sinned. I can tell you exactly how old Eve was when she gave birth to Cain. And the answer is she was 0 years old. She was not even a year old. How can I say that with such certainty? Well, we know that Eve was created in the Garden of Eden, and we know that she did not get pregnant in the Garden of Eden. She's made by the hand of God and commanded to be fruitful and multiply. It did not take multiple attempts for her to become pregnant. Now imagine the scene. They've just been driven out of the Garden of Eden. They know nothing and no one. There's a hostile world that lies ahead of them. It's just the two of them. It's hard to imagine that within days that they didn't have relations, as it's referred to here. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve. In the Hebrew, the word here is yada. Yada means he knew his wife. They ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the knowledge that was being described. Not head knowledge, the way Westerners think of knowledge, but experiential knowledge, one kind of which would be sexual knowledge. Here he knows his wife and she conceives. She gives birth to Cain. Now, the word Cain, of course, doesn't mean anything in English. But in the Hebrew, it has a special meaning, and it really adds to the story. Cain would be spelled Qayin, and Cain meant gotten, purchased, acquired. And we can't be sure, of course, I am reading into this, but my guess is that she named him after the birth. I have gotten, because that's his name. I have gotten with the help of the Lord. This means something very specific in this context. God has evicted them from the Garden of Eden. It would not be unreasonable to assume that there would be no further contact between God and man. But we see here that she attributes the birth to the help of the Lord. This is the curse that was pronounced upon Eve. that she would bring forth children in agony. And this is the first child that is the expression of the curse. I have to imagine it was one of the most painful, if not the most painful birth in human history. I'm sure that many times over the days of her labor that she cried out and asked God for help. And she attributes Cain being alive and her being alive to help from the Lord. What's the name of Adam and Eve's second child? And if it seems like a trick question, it is. And I don't know the name for sure, but I can almost certainly tell you the name that it is not, and that name is Abel. You see, Abel is the name of the second male child. Female births are not recorded. It is thought in Jewish tradition that both Cain and Abel were multiple births. In other words, they were daughters that were born as well. They just weren't identified in the Bible. In all likelihood, Eve, being incredibly fertile, had multiple children in each birth, or at least in some of them. And then there could have been multiple daughters born in between Abel and the birth of Cain. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, I told you what Cain means. The word for Abel in Hebrew is hevel. Hevel means fleeting, or like a breath. I don't know this for certain, but it seems to me that there's a good argument to be made that after the incredible agony of her first childbirth, she was expecting another birth like it. And compared to what it was to give birth to Cain, Abel was like a breath. It was a fleeting moment, so much so that she named her child after the experience. Now, there is a break here of time that occurs in between the first and the second clauses of verse 2. And this is so important, I'd like to spend some time on it. We're told here in verse 2 that she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, we look at that, and we immediately understand what those things are. But go back in time, the thousands of years to when this occurred. There were no flocks. There were no tillers. There was nothing. When Adam and Eve were sent out from the garden, they didn't know what it was like to work, to eat. The fruit was abundantly available. They didn't have to work at all. But now God curses the ground and says that through the sweat of his brow that Adam is going to bring forth food from the earth. But there were no tools. There were no manuals. There was no community of learning. And so I asked Copilot, on his own, how long would it likely have taken Adam to come up with all the knowledge that it would take to bake bread, to be able to farm a crop from which bread could be made? And so you might find this interesting. Copilot said probably in the hundreds or even thousands of years. That's how long it would take for mankind experientially to create this. Now, we know that didn't happen because God talks about them eating bread in Genesis chapter 3, the time of the curse. So the short answer is, this is kind of a logical proof that I'm doing to show you, this could not have happened by random chance. God provided to Adam and Eve the knowledge that they needed to be able to survive in this fallen world. So you take a look at all the different types of things that have to go right. There's no way they could have randomly just discovered that. And remember, this is not something that can be done on day one or even day 101 of their living here. It takes a long time to be able to set up the process by which you can get the materials needed to bake bread. And so initially, Adam would have been a hunter and gatherer. And I think of Adam, and I've actually taken the time to reconstruct what his life must have been like. He had to be a jack of all trades. He had to hunt for food initially for them to live because there was no agriculture. If they needed clothes, he had to kill the animal to get the skins. If there were tools that he needed to be able to do basic farming, he would have to create them because there were no tools to buy. Everything had to be made from scratch and invented, so to speak. And again, without express knowledge from God, this would have been impossible. When would this knowledge have been imparted? I would contend that it was during the time that they were in our world. There's no reason for God to have given them this knowledge while they were in Eden, because they didn't have to do these things in Eden. And so in all likelihood, when we consider that Eve attributes the successful birth of her child to the Lord, and Adam and Eve having knowledge they couldn't possibly have gained on their own through life experience, it seems very likely to me that communication with God continued even though it is not expressly stated in the Bible. Now let's go back to the passage we're looking at, verse 2. Abel was a keeper of flocks. Again, you and I look at that and we say, oh, and I know what that is. But back then, there were no flocks. There were animals, and they weren't friendly to man. The process of building up flocks is a multi-year process. It might take many generations. If you start with the one or two breeding pairs, it's going to take generations to generate flocks. Also, you're going to have to build pens. There's a lot of work to get from day one to where you're going to have flocks that you can be a keeper of. Cain, being a tiller of the ground, likewise, is a specialty. Adam had to do everything because there was no one else. Cain and Abel specialized. Cain coming first, he tilled the ground. His father would have showed him how because God showed him. And Cain brought in a crop seasonally by doing that. And Abel, over time, was a keeper of flocks. Now, how long is it? We know that it had to be a period of years because that's how long it takes to be able to generate flocks. At the end of the chapter, God gives Adam and Eve a replacement for the son that was killed. And we're told in chapter 5 that Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. Now that's very important because one has to imagine that Eve has borne many, many, many dozens of children, possibly over 100 children by that point. But this child is unique. This child gets named because he is the first child that is a replacement for one who has died. And so at the age of 130, Eve gives birth to Seth. So when does that tell us that the murder occurred? Well, assuming that Eve was having children every 1, 2, or 3 years, it had to mean that Adam and Eve were in their 120s. And since they had Cain when they were 0, that would mean that Cain was certainly in his 120s, and probably Abel was as well. Cain is a tiller of the ground. Verse 3. So it came about in the course of time. That's a curious English phrase. If you look it up in the Hebrew, it's a very different wording. It says, came about the end of days. Now that sounds apocalyptic, but it's not the end of all life. It's the end of the days of the season. In other words, it's the end of harvest. That Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought. Now, I am able to deduce from what happens that it is the first offering. Can't be 100% sure. But had there been an earlier offering that was accepted and this one were rejected from Cain, certainly God would have said so. He would have said, well, why did you change, Cain? Why did you this time offer me a substandard offering when last time or the 100 times before this your offerings were all acceptable? So my guess is this is the very first offering. And in all likelihood, they had been in communication with God, and they either had God put it into their hearts to make an offering, or God told them to give him an offering. And so Cain brings an offering of the fruit of the ground, because he was a tiller of the soil. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock. The firstborn is special to God. We know this from the rest of the Bible. And he brings the best, the choicest portions of the best of the lambs that were being sacrificed. So in other words, Abel brings the best. Cain just brings something. And so now we see that the Lord had regard, or the Hebrew word is favor, for Abel and for his offering. Now notice the wording here, for Abel and for his offering. They're mentioned separately, but for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So, what does that mean? It seems to me there are two possible explanations. God's displeasure could have been shown verbally or non-verbally. And for example, it could be that God sent fire from heaven and consumed Abel's offering, and he left Cain's offering untaken. Or it could be that he simply responded verbally. We're not told. But what we can see from what happens here is that Cain and Abel understood what God had done. Because Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. Very angry in the Hebrew. It says that he glowed with anger, which I find a very descriptive phrase. So clearly he understood that God had rejected his offering. If God never spoke to them, and suddenly after 100 years of silence, God speaks, they'd be just astonished. They would be falling all over themselves in wonder that God spoke to me. But there's none of that. It seems like an ordinary occurrence. It's treated no differently than if a human being were speaking. So Cain became very angry, his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. But you must master it." Now, I really had, prior to this Bible study, not identified with Cain at all as a character. Of course, I knew him to be the first murderer, and so there wasn't really much that would recommend him to me to want to study. But for purposes of this Bible study, I really looked into his situation. And I have to admit, I felt sympathy for him. You see in verse 2 that these two sons have specialties. They have professions. Again, Adam had no specialty. He had to be everything. But his sons specialize. Abel was a keeper of flocks. Cain was a tiller of the ground. It sounds even. Nothing could be further from the truth. Being a shepherd, even in those days, was relatively easy as a profession. Much of what you do is you lead your flock out and you take them to places where they have fresh grass and you lead them beside still water and then you bring them back in. That's a large part of your job. Yes, occasionally you do have to defend them against wild animals. Yes, you do have to help with the birthings. And so there are parts that are difficult. I'm not saying it was an easy job, but let's compare it to what Cain had to do. To be a tiller of the ground when the ground has been cursed is agonizingly difficult work. I asked Copilot, if Cain prepared and tilled an entire field, how much grain would he be able to produce from it based on crop yields at that time? And the answer was, from a field, he'd produce enough to feed 2 people. That's it. He was in the most unforgiving profession imaginable, a profession essentially that had been cursed by God. Every day he cut his hands on thorns and bruised himself on rocks and had to pull out weeds and had to fight against the earth itself to bring forth the crop. And when he did bring forth a crop, it was incredibly meager compared to how easy it would have been to get other food. Remember, even though the earth has been cursed, we're still talking about the Crescent Valley. We're talking about the land in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which is teeming with all different kinds of life. And so one has to imagine that over the years, Cain sees what his life is like and what his brother's life is like. And he is not happy. Doesn't seem fair. And the more I studied it, the more I wanted to ask God the question, God, why would you expect the same from Cain that you did from Abel? Abel has an easy life. Cain has it hard. Of course he's going to be resentful. Of course he's going to be less grateful. That's just human nature. And it reminded me of another story, and it's a story that you know well. So I want to show you this comparison between Cain and Abel, 2 brothers, and in the New Testament, the prodigal son, the younger brother, and his older brother is told by Jesus. Let's take a look at what these older brothers have in common. The older brother is the one who carries the heavier burden, works in the hardest domain, feels overlooked and under-rewarded, interprets the responsibility entrusted to him as unfairness. Resentment poisons gratitude. Both of them are warned, either by God or by the Father, but both refuse correction. Let's take a look at the younger brother. Lives a much easier life, has freedom to choose a lighter path, is grateful when he is shown mercy, and becomes the catalyst for the older brother's crisis. And again, as a human being, just trying to put myself in these positions, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for the older brother. It does seem unfair because they're not being treated the same. And here's the moral of both stories. Hard life circumstances are not necessarily a punishment. Ease is not necessarily favoritism. God requires the same gratitude from all people, those who have easy lives and those who have hard lives. There's no partiality, there's no difference, even though the life circumstances may be drastically different. And is it harder for the one who's had the harder life to be grateful? Yes, it is. But that is what God requires. So Cain gives a substandard offering. And Cain is judged lacking. Not just the offering, but Cain the person. Because remember it says in verse 5, for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. And this is very consistent with what we're told by the author of Hebrews in the faith chapter, in chapter 11 of Hebrews, where it says that by faith Abel brought a better offering to God. So in other words, Abel offered the choice portions that he did by faith. And impliedly, Cain offered the substandard offering that he did out of resentment, out of bitterness for his harder life that at first glance seems to be justified. But look at how God responds, because this is very important to the story. God does not damn him because of his faithless offering. Instead, listen to the way he speaks to him. Like a man might speak to his son. Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? God doesn't need Cain to answer him. God knows all things. This is for Cain's benefit. If you do well, Cain, will not your countenance be lifted up? In other words, if you offer me out of the right heart attitude, I will accept you. I will treat you the same as I treat your brother. Your offering will be accepted. Your countenance will raise up again. And if you do not do well, in other words, if you don't fix what's wrong on the inside, the offering is the outward evidence of what's going on in the inside. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door and its desires for you, but you must master it. And we're going to spend all of next lesson figuring out what that means. God's speech to Cain is personal reassurance of fairness, and it's also a warning to protect him. He could have just let him go down the wrong path without warning, but he looked out for him. He told him the truth, and he did it fairly. Cain was not abandoned to his fate by God to become a murderer. God engaged with him. God wanted Cain to succeed. He wanted him to choose the right path. Cain is not cursed personally. The ground was cursed. Instead, he was coached personally by God. Cain is not left to interpret his hardship alone. God interprets it for him. In other words, if you just look at the circumstances, it seems unfair. And so God helps him to understand. Remember, God has been talking with him this whole time because there's no evidence of shock or surprise when God speaks with him here. Cain's responsibility comes from God's presence, not from Cain's circumstances. Even though Cain's circumstances may be difficult, God is still present in his life, and Cain must respond to God in the manner that God deems acceptable, not Cain. That's the essence of the sin here. Cain deigned to choose, this is how much I'll give you, God. I'm going to give you a poor offering because you've given me a poor life. And God essentially says, that's not acceptable. Be grateful. Even though your lot is harder, I require the same gratefulness of you that I do from your brother. Cain's tragedy is not the fact of his hardship. It is refusing the one that could have carried him through the hardship. And a great example of that is his mom. She sinned. She chose wrongly. And then she had to pay the price for it, the agony of that horrible childbirth. But who does she give the credit for getting her through that childbirth? God. Cain could have heroically said, I've had a hard lot in life, but God has sustained me. I'm still here. I'm still fed. I still have a future, and I choose to credit God with all of that. Regardless of your lot in life, whether it's hard or whether it's easy, don't think that you can come before God and say, well, I experienced misfortune, bad things happened to me, and therefore I'm not going to show you gratitude because I'm not grateful for the lot you gave me. God doesn't accept that. It's very understandable that people feel this way. But God shows us through these stories of Cain and Abel and the prodigal son that God does not accept from the person who has greater responsibility or greater hardship the answer, well, I'm just going to be bitter and resentful because you weren't fair to me. God does not allow that attitude. So there's so much that we can learn here from their story, and I hope that you now see it in a more detailed and lifelike way, and not just as a few verses in the early pages of Genesis.